Yes.
Mark Shaw, welcome to the Russell Scott Show.
Hey, thank you, Russell.
Mark Shaw is an investigative reporter and former legal analyst for USA Today, CNN, and USA Today. He is the author of over 25 books, including How the Betrayals of Joseph Kennedy Caused the Assassination of JFK, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, and his latest, Denial of Justice. In today's interview, Mark Shaw tells the story of reporter Dorothy Kilgallen, who is digging into the assassination of President JFK when she was found dead in her apartment. Mark, perhaps I'm the reporter who knew too little, but I've never heard of Dorothy Kilgallen. Who was she?
Russell, what have you been living out in the desert or something? Come on. No, and I'm just saying that in jest. And I do it because I didn't know who she was earlier until at all either, much about her until about 2000 and first time probably about 2010, something like that. Anyway, I'll just give you the idea of what happened exactly. I had never been interested in the JFK assassination. I remember where I was, as everybody else does my age, when it happened. But I didn't look into it much. I pretty much bought what J. Edgar Hoover was shouting, that it was Oswald alone, and that was it. And then Jack Ruby shot Oswald. And so, you go on through the years and you hear things about it and all of that. But I didn't pay much attention until I decided to write a book about a famous San Francisco lawyer named Melvin Belli. And for those who don't remember him, he was this bigger-than-life attorney, mostly in the torts area. He sued pharmaceutical companies and other companies and got million-dollar verdicts, the first of those to be awarded. But he also had kind of an A-list of clients: Muhammad Ali, the Rolling Stones, Tammy Faye Baker, all the big names at the time as civil clients. And so I knew Mr. Belli because, Russell, I practiced law in his building in about 88 or 89, somewhere in there, in downtown San Francisco. And he and I became friends, and we got to know each other real well and all of that. And so when he died in 1996, I decided to write a biography of him. And I did so because he had written 2 autobiographies, and they conflicted, and that was what Belli was like. He was just an amazing attorney, but many times kind of shaded the truth here and there. So I decided to write a book about him, and I finally did. It was called Melvin Belli, King of the Courtroom. But while researching that book, I started to learn more about Belli, and one of his main clients was a gangster in L.A. named Mickey Cohen. And Belli kind of liked to say, and I remember this, that he kind of was part of the mafia, or knew a lot of mafioso and all that kind of thing. He thought that was kind of a big deal. But I interviewed a doctor friend of his in San Diego, and we were talking about Belli and his recollections and everything. And then he said, by the way, Mark, Belli knew Dorothy Kilgallen. And I said, well, wait a minute. The only thing I know about her is that she was on the CBS show that ran 15 years called What's My Line? Every Sunday night at 10:30 East Coast time. It was a live show, and for those that don't remember, it was a quiz show where they guessed occupations, unusual occupations. Like somebody owned a wax museum, or somebody sold dynamite, or something like that. And so Dorothy was pretty much the premier panelist of the 4. It was Arlene Francis, who was an actress, Bennett Cerf, who was the founder of Random House, as a matter of fact, and Dorothy, and then a celebrity guest. Sometimes like Tony Randall would be there, Johnny Carson, and John Daly was the host, and they guessed these occupations. I said, well, yeah, what Belli was on What's My Line? He said, Mark, you don't know anything about her. Yes, she was on that show, but she was a syndicated columnist for the New York Journal-American in the 50s and 60s, syndicated to 200 newspapers across the country. She and her husband hosted a radio show every day, listened to by millions in New York City. And she covered the main trials of the 20th century at the time, the Dr. Sam Shepard case, which became the Fugitive movie with Harrison Ford, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, a lot of other big cases. And, she covered the Jack Ruby trial when he was put on trial for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. I said, yeah, I didn't have any idea about that. And he said, Mark, it's interesting. When Dorothy Kilgallen died in 1965, Belli said to me, well, they've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Jack Ruby. They've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Jack Ruby. And I said, what? He said, yeah, he connected all of that together. And so I thought about it, and then I kind of let it go, because the next book, what I did was look back at the 1960 election when Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, and the book is called The Poisoned Patriarch, basically helped fix the 60 election by, he knew they were going to lose Illinois and West Virginia, and so he called in some of his mafia friends, and they helped him win those states, and JFK got in the White House. But Joe had promised if they won, that they would leave those mafia guys alone, and right away after JFK was elected, JFK appointed Bobby Kennedy Attorney General, and just into 1961 then, right away, Bobby Kennedy went after those guys. And so I wrote a book about that and started to look at the JFK assassination differently than I think anybody ever has. I started to look at why Bobby Kennedy was not killed instead of why JFK was, because as I found out, even from the prosecutor of Jack Ruby who talked to me, Bobby had a lot more enemies than JFK did, especially in the mafia group, because he was the one that went after them. So I wrote that book, and then I was really done, but I could never, I'm a curious guy like I'm sure you are, Russell. I could never get that quote from Belli's friend in San Diego out of my mind, and that's when I started to learn more about Dorothy Kilgallen, research her life and times, and then her tragic death in 1965.
Dorothy Kilgallen aside, why write about the JFK assassination? What can be said that hasn't been said already?
Well, this is all new, and the reason it's all new, the material in my books, is because I look at the JFK assassination in the way that I told you, why Bobby wasn't killed instead of why JFK was. But more than that, I've been gifted with a gift, and that is Dorothy Kilgallen. I don't know why she chose me to write her story, but I'm flattered that she did. And through her eyes, Russell, I look at the assassination, as an eyewitness through Dorothy, because, in case you don't know, all of the books that have been written through the years, very, very little has ever been written about Dorothy Kilgallen, and yet she's the exception to the rule, because unlike me or anybody else who's ever written about the assassinations, Dorothy Kilgallen was there in Dallas at the Jack Ruby trial, in the front row, listening to the Ruby trial testimony. She's the only reporter, Russell, to have ever interviewed Jack Ruby at trial. She did it twice out of 400 reporters. She started writing columns right after JFK died. And let me explain why she launched this investigation, because JFK were personal friends. They knew each other from watering holes in famous watering holes in New York City. He had been to her home and played charades there. They were very close friends. And at one point, JFK invited her to the White House, and she took her little son, Kerry, who was in the 3rd grade. And Pierre Salinger set it up so that JFK would meet with them in the library, and he made a big fuss over Kerry, praised him for the letters he brought from his 3rd grade class. And so when JFK died, after she cried her eyes out for her friend being killed, it was personal because of what she had done for Kerry. In fact, in the books, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and also Denial of Justice, I say that Dorothy wrote in one of her columns, what I remember is a tall man stooping over a little boy, praising the letters that he brought from his 3rd grade class. This is the man who was killed in Dallas. So you would learn, if you know more about Dorothy, that when she went after a case, went after something, she went full bore. She had the best sources. They called her the most powerful female voice in America. The New York Post did. Hemingway said she was the greatest female writer in the world. I mean, she was a big deal. And so when she was at the Jack Ruby trial, 6 days after, first she wrote a profile of Ruby called Ruby Stars at Last, which is incredible writing about who he was as she watched him across the courtroom. And then she started her columns. The first one was The Oswald File Must Not Close. She wrote a huge number of columns after that, but basically she didn't buy what J. Edgar Hoover was shouting, which was the Oswald alone theory. And so she was going the wrong way on a one-way street. And after she interviewed Ruby then, she continued to investigate, and we can get into that. But right at that particular point, she had put a target on her back because as I say, she wasn't buying what Hoover was trying to sell, and it really put her in danger.
Were there any other journalists at that time dismissing the official narrative, particularly looking into these Jack Ruby transcripts?
Yeah, well, she's the first and only. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe, but we're going to talk about the Jack Ruby trial transcripts in a minute because they're the best primary source of what happened when JFK and Oswald were killed. But everybody missed it. I think everybody. I've talked to people for this new book I'm writing that'll be out next year, and trying to figure out what happened back then. And they were all saying, everybody wanted to seal that up. They wanted to believe it was Oswald. 1963, if you remember, was a tumultuous year in the United States. A lot of things going on with the civil unrest and different kinds of things going on, and people just wanted to believe it was some lone nut who killed JFK, and that was the end of it. And so everybody missed it, and so the columnists didn't print anything. Dorothy was the only one that did, and unfortunately, I think somewhat because she was a woman, somewhat because she was on the quiz show, her columns weren't taken seriously at that particular time, and they certainly are today, that's for sure.
Would Dorothy Kilgallen have been classified as a gossip columnist?
No. The column that she had was called Voice of Broadway, and as I say, syndicated to 200 newspapers. It really was a mixed bag. Yes, there was some talk of the Hollywood stars and the Broadway stars, and she even got into the Mafia on that trial. She would talk about everything. She had the latest information. It was a must-see column. I've had people tell me that's the first thing they read in the mornings when people actually read newspapers. So it was a mixed bag, but for the most part, she had this credibility. She could straddle the line between being on a quiz show, writing a column like that, but when she shined was when she went to these trials. You can look. I found an old TV guide from the days of the Dr. Sam Shepard case, which I'm sure you may be familiar with. He was alleged to have murdered his wife, was the one-armed man, and all of that was in the film The Fugitive. Well, there's a whole article in there about Dorothy and her being at the trial and her getting her, the judge wanting her autograph and all of that, and that she was up at 5 a.m. and working till midnight. My favorite photo of her, and I don't want to forget to mention to your listeners this website, the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, where photos of Dorothy, quotes about her, her columns, interviews that we want to talk about, especially one with Jack Ruby's co-counsel, with people who knew her. Everything is up there, but my favorite photograph is on the homepage of that website. And it's Dorothy standing, Russell, in the middle of the courtroom at the Dr. Sam Shepard case, and all the reporters are hovered around her. She had such respect, such admiration, because unlike an awful lot of the news that we get today, where they look for a sensational headline and then they link the news, whatever it is, to that, Dorothy went out there and found the facts, presented them, and then let people make up their own mind, which is how it should be done. So, nobody else caught this. Nobody else was doing it. It was Dorothy, the lone wolf, out there shouting, "There's more to this case than the damn Oswald alone theory." That's for sure.
Okay, let's talk more about the Jack Ruby transcripts. You've alluded to them a few times now.
Well, what's interesting is, and I'm embarrassed a little bit to say this, but I had written 3 books: the Lie book, The Poisoned Patriarch, and The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. And I don't know why. I never thought about the Ruby trial transcripts. Like I say, I'm embarrassed. But to date, I've probably gotten at least 3,000 to 4,000 emails from people around the world. The Reporter Who Knew Too Much became a bestseller in Denial of Justice 2 now. And so I've heard from people around the world who've read the books, who've watched my presentations on YouTube. There's almost 2 million views up there and all of that. But one day I got a call from this lawyer in Fresno. He said, "Mark, I bought your book at 5 and read it by 10. And that always makes me feel wonderful that they did, and now that they know about Dorothy." But he said, "I have a gift for you." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I have a copy of the Ruby trial transcripts." I said, "Oh my God, I never even thought. I thought about that." He said, "Yes, I'm from Dallas. I live in Fresno, but I'm a history buff, And I thought I could find these, but I wasn't sure how. And finally, I looked everywhere, and I went to the Dallas County Library, went back in the stacks among the dust, and there they were, a stack of 2,000 pages of the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. And he said, I've put them on CDs, and I'm gonna ship them to you. And he did. So it took me about 2 to 3 weeks to go through them all, and I was just shocked at what I saw in there. And what was so interesting for me that I think will find your listeners will find interesting is that this is what Dorothy heard. This is what she watched in the courtroom. This is why she said to people just before she died, "I'm going to crack this case open. I know that there was a plot to kill the president. I'm going to put all this in my book I'm writing for Random House." Well, the Ruby trial transcripts are the key to all of that. And I just want to tell you that there were 4 things that popped out at me that nobody ever knew about until I published them in Denial of Justice. Now, excerpts are now up on my website, markshawbooks.com, so people can go look at them and everything, but I exposed them in Denial of Justice, and there were 4 things that came out of there. Number 1 is that Jack Ruby was actually in the Dallas Morning News offices, which were down the block from Daley Plaza, at exactly the same time that JFK was killed. And he was looking out a window down toward there with the employees. And of course, it could be coincidence for sure, but him being there at the exact time that JFK was killed makes you wonder about that. The second thing was that I found a eyewitness who Dorothy heard at the trial, watched the trial. He owned a parking lot right across the street from the Carousel Club, which Jack Ruby owned. And this is important for history's sake because there's been so many distortions of history about this. Jack Ruby said that he just happened to be downtown and happened to go over to the Dallas Police Department basement and happened to walk in, and then here just happened to come Oswald and they happened to shoot him. Well, the Ruby trial transcripts destroy that, because the first thing that happened is there's this parking lot owner who testifies in court that Jack Ruby came over on the day before he shot Oswald, and he wanted to use the pay phone. And the manager listened, and Ruby said, "Listen, when are they going to transfer Oswald?" And then there was a pause, and then Ruby said, "I will be there." And I have that transcript excerpt right in my hands right here to look at. So that was the first thing. So it made no sense, and he said he just happened to be there. The other 2 things were he admitted, another witness admitted that Ruby had said, "I made like a reporter to get into the basement. I had a notepad and I had a pencil, and I used that, plus all my friends from the Dallas Police Department helped me get into the basement." Now, that's not anybody speculating that happened. That's right in the transcripts. And that's what just shocked me when I looked at them, because it put a whole new perspective on Ruby obviously being involved in all of this, and that it wasn't Oswald alone, and there were others that were involved in the plot to kill the president. In fact, it wasn't too long ago where I learned that the first visitor to Jack Ruby when he was arrested was a guy named Joe Campisi, who was a mafioso in Dallas and connected to Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, the New Orleans Don, and I'd like to be able to tell you how that connects into exactly what Dorothy Kilgallen believed happened, because the first thing she did after the trial was over, after she'd interviewed Ruby, was take a trip to New Orleans.
We'll talk about it in a moment, but aren't these Jack Ruby trial transcripts a matter of public record?
Well, they were, but nobody ever looked at them. Now, there's a couple places on the internet where you can find them now, but unfortunately, of course, somebody looks at them, and I think what happened is, they're 2,000 pages, and nobody's going to go through there. Now, I'm pleased to say that a university has asked me, my alma mater, for my papers and everything else, and we're going to be able to index those so that people can go in there and look for certain things, but nobody ever did. I didn't. I'm ashamed to say I didn't either. And until this guy, this lawyer, got in touch with me, I never thought that that they were available. So your question is well taken, but nobody ever gave a damn about them, frankly.
Okay, so the legitimacy of these transcripts is irrefutable.
Oh, absolutely. The original, in fact, what I did is I embedded them, many of the excerpts, in Denial of Justice, and with the actual pages, the yellowed pages, and they're up on markshawbooks.com. People can read them there, or in Denial of Justice. Didn't that just surprise you that those things were out there like it did me?
Yeah, it's a little bizarre, to be honest.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to Joe Campisi and New Orleans.
Okay. Well, when Joe Kennedy fixed the election, and there's no question that happened. It's been chronicled. I use primary sources, and other primary sources have proven all that happened because they needed to win the White House. When Bobby Kennedy was appointed Attorney General, and I had an eyewitness that was in the Reporter Knew Too Much, who told me that basically Joe ordered JFK to appoint Bobby Kennedy Attorney General. And when that happened, then Bobby Kennedy, who detested the mafia from the McClellan hearings that he was involved in prior to JFK being elected president, went after those guys. The names they're familiar to a lot of people: Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, Frank Costello, but one of them was Carlos Marcello. And he was the billion-dollar Don, they used to call him, in New Orleans, because he ran all of the rackets there, all of the slot machines, all of the prostitution, everything. And his empire stretched to Dallas. And that Joe Campisi that I mentioned, Ruby actually had dinner at Campisi's restaurant the night before he shot Oswald, and then Campisi was the first visitor to Ruby at the jail. Again, everybody missed all of that, but Dorothy didn't, because the first thing she did was go to New Orleans, where Marcello was, because when Bobby Kennedy was first appointed Attorney General, he first of all deported Carlos Marcello, and when he got back in the country, he tried to deport him again, as of November 1963, he had charged Marcello with racketeering. So Dorothy Kilgallen figured out what I finally figured out, that when Bobby Kennedy did that to Marcello, Marcello said to himself, my back's against the wall, I've got to do something about this. And so he surmised, if I kill Bobby Kennedy, who I hate, Jack Kennedy will come after me with everything the government has. But if I kill Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy will be powerless. Common sense. And Russell, that's exactly what happened. This doesn't take a great intellect to figure this out, because I am not one. I'm from a small town in Indiana. I'm not the smartest guy who ever lived. But if you look at this, and this is what thousands and millions of people around the world now have done, it's just amazing how common sense it is, because Marcello then orchestrated the JFK assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald was a bit player in that. When Oswald was arrested, then they had to bring somebody in to silence Jack Ruby, and that's exactly what Melvin Belli did, so that Ruby never spoke at trial or anything. And so Kilgallen had figured all that out. And so she ended up taking this trip to New Orleans, and that's where the danger begins, because she had a hairdresser she was very close to. He went with her to New Orleans, and then he says on a videotape that people can listen to, videotaped interview on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, that when they got there, she called him at the hotel and said, go back to New York City, don't tell anybody you were here, and don't ask any questions. And then Dorothy returned to New York City, and she started being a blabbermouth. She started telling everyone, as I said, I'm going to crack the case wide open. I know that there was a plot to kill the president. I'm going to put all this in a book that I'm writing for Random House. And what happened then, about a month later, Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse, in a bedroom she never slept in, wearing her false eyelashes, a hairpiece, and makeup she never wore to bed, in bedclothes she never wore to bed, lying in bed, and basically died right there. What happened after that is alarming, because when I finally interviewed the Dorothy Kilgallen's butler's daughter, and she gave an account that right after the body was found by the hairdresser, FBI agents, or those posing as FBI agent, came charged into the home and confiscated all of her papers, documents, everything, her file about the JFK assassination investigation. After they left, the police finally came. They took one look at an empty Seconal bottle, which is sleeping pills, and decided right away that she had overdosed, even though there was no evidence that she ever had a drug problem or that she was an alcoholic or anything like that. They basically just decided on the spot, you talk about rush to judgment, that she had died of an overdose. It was another celebrity who had done that and everything. The terrible part of this is there was absolutely no investigation into Dorothy Kilgallen's death. And basically her file has never been found. And so basically Dorothy disappeared from the face of the earth until 2018, when I'm pleased to say that I in some ways brought her back to life by publishing The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and presenting to the public all of this information that nobody ever knew about, including me.
Hairdressers are much like bartenders. People do talk to them. But how do you assess or measure the credibility of one?
Well, that's a good point, and there's two of them that are quoted. You have to look at the videotapes. Maybe you're wondering what everybody else is wondering. Who stood up for Dorothy Kilgallen when she died? Well, I'll tell you right now, nobody did. Not her family, not the people at What's My Line, not her newspaper colleagues, not her friends, nobody. And you're probably asking yourself, well, why? If she was this, 10,000 people went to her funeral. Why wouldn't somebody have stood up and said, wait a minute, she would not have overdosed. She didn't have an alcoholic problem. Something's wrong here. Well, the reason is they were scared. They believed that if they knew she was working on the JFK assassination. If the same people that killed at JFK killed Dorothy, they didn't want to come out and stand up and say, hey, we don't think this really happened. So it's the same sort of situation that happened with the hairdressers. The interviews with them, both of them, who were very close friends of hers, and that's been documented. The interviews, if you look at them on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, you can make up your own mind as to what they're saying, but they're very credible. And then I've confirmed them with regard to what happened with other pieces of evidence. But were not interviewed, Russell, until 1999 and 2000. They said basically they still were never going to talk about this, but now that almost 50 years had gone by, they felt comfortable doing so because they had been scared for all that time. So you're right, but I will tell you, if people look at those, listen to those, and watch those videotaped interviews, and then look at the evidence that I presented in both of the books, I think they will find those two hairdressers and others who talk about Dorothy very credible.
Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Yet you write a book about the very thing that allegedly got Dorothy Kilgallen killed. Is this a situation where, hey, much like the hairdressers, over 50 years have gone by, this is something I feel I can safely discuss?
Well, and it's a credible time to do it. I've mentioned what happened with regard to Dorothy and everything else, but through Dr. Cyril Weck and Dr. Michael Baden and others who have looked at the autopsy that was performed, the forensic evidence, witnesses who talk about, the autopsy was obviously very botched. They said there was only one barbiturate in Dorothy's system. There were three. There were remnants on the glass that was in her bedroom showing phenobarbital, one of the three barbiturates that somebody had. We believe what I believe has been proven, and the forensic scientists agree that she was poisoned, either at the Regency Hotel bar the night before she died, assisted by the activities of a mystery man at the time, they called him, who I've identified as Ron Pataki, a journalist friend of hers who's still alive and lives in Columbus, Ohio, and we need to talk about him a little bit. Or at home, Pataki, we believe, accompanied her home, and at one of those two places, those barbiturates, the capsules were poured. The ingredients were poured into a vodka and tonic, and that's what caused the death of Dorothy Kilgallen. So there's all of the forensic evidence. There's all of the proof showing she was in danger. The unusual, there's no question, I think most people around the world believe there was a staged death scene there. when you look at it, I look at everything as a former criminal defense lawyer having to do motive. And I'm doing the same thing in a new book that I'm writing, because I'm comparing Dorothy Kilgallen's death connection to Marilyn Monroe's and to JFK's. And in each situation, motive sticks out. Dorothy had opened her mouth and let everybody know, including Marcello and everybody that was involved, we believe, in the assassination, that she was going to print all this in this book for Random House. They couldn't let her write that book, and that's why she was killed.
I think the lesson to be learned here is to publish the book first, before you open your mouth. The book acts as your safety net.
Yes, absolutely. And Dorothy didn't keep a copy of that file and everything, but she put herself out there. People have called her a patriot. There's a couple guys who go to her tombstone in New York, and place flowers there all the time. She was a real patriot. But she was like you, Russell. I mean, you take chances. You get on the air and you air things like this or other things that are controversial. You put yourself at risk. I do too. It's part of what we do. Unfortunately, Dorothy, you would have hoped somebody would have stood up for her at that particular time. We always hope that will happen if somebody hears something about us and says, hey, that's not like Russell. He wouldn't have done that. But for Dorothy, that didn't happen. Now, what I've done in both books, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and Denial of Justice, they're true crime murder mysteries, because there are 4 or 5 suspects who could have killed Dorothy. One is her husband, Richard. They were estranged. He was upset with her that she was going to change her will. 2 quotes that I should mention that I'd forgotten. She told one hairdresser right before she died, I'm afraid for my life and my family, and I'm getting a gun, and I'm changing my will. And she told Charles Simpson, the other one, if the wrong people knew what I know about the JFK assassination, it would cost me my life. And she was dead shortly thereafter. But Richard, her husband, had every motive to have killed her. He had the opportunity and the means, because he was right there in the townhouse, asleep on supposedly the 4th floor when she was found dead on the 3rd. There's Frank Sinatra. She and Kilgallen and Frank Sinatra were at odds. She had written a couple columns about his bimbo girlfriends and his links to the mafia, and I've found some great photos of Sinatra with his mafia buddies for the new book, Collateral Damage, it's called. And so Sinatra didn't like that, and so he got all after her in his act, saying, Dorothy Kilgallen's the chinless wonder. She doesn't even have a chin. She's blind. She can't see. Here's her figure, and he held up a key. At one point, he said, "If you run into Dorothy Kilgallen, do so with a bus." So you have Richard. You have Frank Sinatra. You obviously have J. Edgar Hoover, because in her book, we believe that she was going to allege that Hoover had covered up the assassination, which I think most people in the world now believe was true. You have Carlos Marcello, and you have this guy named Ron Pataki. And Pataki was a confidant of Kilgallen. She shared with him her JFK assassination investigation evidence, and it just wasn't too long ago, and that'll be in the new book, where I found an eyewitness who told me that basically just before Dorothy died, Pataki had gotten himself into some trouble. And this is a guy in Las Vegas who was associated with the mafia. He told me that Pataki was in trouble, and the wrong people, he called them, came to Pataki and said, look, we need to know exactly what Dorothy Kilgallen is going to put in that book for Random House, and if you help us, we'll get you out of trouble. Pataki was compromised. We believe that he went ahead and told them what she was going to put in the book, and about 2 weeks later, she was dead. So there's a lot of suspects. It's a lot of people have guessed what they believe could have happened and who was more responsible, but most people come back to Carlos Marcello based on the motive that he had.
This Ron Pataki, were him and Dorothy Kilgallen having an affair, or was it a platonic friendship?
Well, in my books, I talk about my subjects, all of them, warts and all. She and Richard, her husband, had become estranged. He was running around with every Broadway star. He was a Broadway producer who'd become an alcoholic. He was running around with everyone. Dorothy Kilgallen then had 2 affairs. One with Johnny Ray. You're way too young to remember who that is, but he was a famous singer at the time. Little White Cloud That Cried was his main hit, and they had an affair. Then that ended, and she got involved with Ron Pataki. And one of the reasons that I have, and just quickly mention it, is that I asked the New York District Attorney's Office to reinvestigate Dorothy's death 2 years ago, and they did, only to at one point drop it because basically it was too expensive, it was taking too much time, and all of that was because I wanted them to investigate Pataki, who's 85 years old and lives in Columbus. And one of the main reasons that I did so was because, based on, again, my experience as a criminal defense lawyer, you want to look, when you're looking at somebody and assessing whether they had something to do with a crime, you want to be able to find out things that they know that only the killer could know. Pataki wrote 2 poems that he says don't have anything to do with Dorothy's death. I'll just read you one of them, and you can tell me whether or not you think this is about Dorothy. He wrote, "Vodka roulette seen as a relief possibility. While I'm spilling my guts, she's driving me nuts. Please fetch us 2 drinks on the run. Just skip all the noise and make one of them poison, and don't even tell me which one." That is exactly the way that Dorothy Kilgallen died. Poison in a drink. I'm spilling my guts, which coincides with exactly what I was told by this casino boss in Las Vegas, that he was spilling his gut. And so I gave that to the New York District Attorney's Office. That's one of the reasons they opened the case. Now, I haven't given up trying to get...
Let me stop you there for a sec. Where exactly did this poem surface?
On his website. And there's another one. You'll just get a kick out of this one. How's this sound? "There's a way to quench a gossip stench that never fails. One cannot write if zippered tight. Somebody who's dead can tell no tales." So this is one of the reasons I got to the DA to investigate, and they gave up on it. So about a month ago, I was in New York City. I was able to briefly meet with the New York Police Commissioner, Dermot Shea, and I got him to agree that one of his detectives and I could start communicating with regard to them opening her case. And a lot of it has, again, to do with the fact that Pataki, if it's not investigated pretty soon, this man's going to get away with murder, basically, or being an accomplice to murder. So these poems are prima facie evidence, but there's much more about him that basically, if I were going in front of a jury as a prosecutor, I'd convict this guy in about 5 minutes.
He had motive, he had means, you have the circumstantial evidence surrounding it with these poems. You could have convicted him. But here's the question. Could you have successfully defended him?
Well, basically people always used to ask me, "Mark, can you defend somebody you know is guilty?" Well, if you even think about that as a defense attorney, you should resign your license and never practice again. You don't do that as a defense lawyer. You take the evidence as it is, and you give that person every constitutional right they have. Now, one of the reasons that I finally gave up being a criminal defense lawyer is I got really tired of defending people that I obviously knew were guilty, and I felt like that atmosphere was something I wanted to be in, and that's when I started doing other things. But would I defend him if he came to me? Certainly I would, but I don't believe I would be successful in that case.
Do we know anything today about what Dorothy Kilgallen may have known regarding the JFK assassination that, as she put it, would have blown the case wide open?
Well, it was this Ruby trial transcript material. That's the big breakthrough.
Yeah, but she wasn't the only person in that courtroom.
No, but she's the only one that wrote those columns, and everybody else missed it. Let me just, you'll get a kick out of this, or it'll shock you as it did me. I've been able to get 2 journals that were kept by juries, by jurors in the case. Wayman Rose is one of them. The other guy's name's Causey, who was the jury foreman. I got their journals. They weren't supposed to keep one, but they did, and I got them. Well, in these situations, I went back and looked because they detailed each day of the trial. And I went back and looked at when, for instance, that alarming testimony by Mr. Hallmark, who was the parking lot attendant, when he said what he did about Ruby telling whoever was on the phone or saying, when will Oswald be transferred, and I will be there. That alarming testimony was, there's not even a mention of it in the journal. You see, they were all brainwashed, basically, and the American public's been brainwashed for thousands of years here, not thousands, hundreds of years with regard to the whole situation with regard to this Oswald alone thing. And so all of the other reporters and the jurors and everything bought that ludicrous theory. I'll tell you, it's perpetuated at the sixth floor museum at Daley Plaza in Dallas that I finally figured out, because I tried to give them about a year ago all of my material about Ruby, or about Kilgallen, my books, my papers, my research, everything else, and at first they really wanted them, and then they decided they didn't, and I figured out, if you go to that museum, it's basically a shrine to Lee Harvey Oswald. There's no evidence of the Ruby trial transcripts existing. There's nothing about Kilgallen. They don't allow anything in there in that museum that doesn't have to do with Oswald alone. You know, people ask me, why is all this important now, Russell? Well, it's all about history and distortions of history. And you know, we're really concerned in this country right now with regard to the education that children are getting, that they should know about black history. They should know more about white history. They should know all of those things. And in many schools, they still teach, when they come to the JFK assassination, the Oswald alone theory. That's got to stop. That's got to stop.
I hate the term conspiracy theory. I consider it to be quite dismissive.
You noticed I didn't mention it. I don't mention it.
You did not. But the one so-called conspiracy theory that most people will agree on is that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the sole gunman or conspirator behind JFK's assassination.
Oh yeah, I think people have wakened up. I think they, you know, young people especially, and I've heard from hundreds of them who, you know, don't buy that happening. But you know, we have these cover-ups of material, and the reason I don't like the C word is because it lumps everything together, and it just makes it sound like, you know, in the new book that I'm writing, I am really trying to humanize more Dorothy, JFK, and Marilyn Monroe, because in many ways people just look at them as how they died, and nothing really important about the lives they led and what the impact was when they died. I mean, Dorothy, I've got an article in the new book from Good Housekeeping magazine where she talks about motherhood and what Carrie meant to her when he was born. If you look at Marilyn Monroe's diary and her book that she wrote, she talks about wanting to be a mother and the things that she did. Not that they said she died incredibly of a probable suicide, like Dorothy died of an overdose of barbiturates, circumstances undetermined. And the same is with JFK. Instead of looking at many of the things that he did that were positive in his life, the only thing they remember that he was assassinated. So I'm trying in the new book to really humanize them, because people should know more about them and what they did during their lives, and the positives that they brought when they were alive.
You're releasing a new book, Collateral Damage,
yes,
where you compare the similarities of the deaths of JFK, Dorothy Kilgallen, and Marilyn Monroe.
Correct.
Marilyn Monroe died in a similar way to Dorothy Kilgallen. However, in her case, there had been a history of drug abuse, whereas with Dorothy Kilgallen, there had not.
Well, there's conjecture to that, but there's no question that she was using barbiturates to help her sleep. The main similarity that you have that has disturbed me, and the reason I put this up, people had kept asking me in interviews and all these emails I get and everything else, you know, what about the connection between Dorothy and Marilyn's death? Well, the connection between those two and JFK's is, number one, the autopsies. Dorothy's was botched for sure. Thomas Noguchi, who was the autopsy, the coroner to the stars, having done all the famous cases back then, admitted that he botched the autopsy. He forgot to take certain fluids from her body, and by the time he tried to get the organs, they were gone. JFK's autopsy has always been questioned in terms of exactly what happened there. The other thing is the investigations. No investigation in Dorothy's death. the investigation into Marilyn's death was not done by the police. It wasn't done by investigators. They basically appointed a panel of psychiatrists to see what her mindset was before she died, and that is completely botched because Marilyn was on the upswing. Now, she had had an affair with Bobby Kennedy, and we believe he's one of the main suspects in her death because she was going to she had been, like Dorothy, a blabbermouth, saying she was going to talk about to the media her relationships with JFK and RFK. But she was on the upswing. She had a new motion picture deal with Fox. She was going to do a Broadway. Everything was going great. With JFK, he had everything to live for, and he was assassinated, but there was really no proper investigation of his death because J. Edgar Hoover stepped in, took the case away from the Dallas police, and basically that investigation is as phony as any that was ever, was ever in progress. So there's similarities with regard to those three situations, but I want people to know who these three individuals were and what they meant while they were living. I think that's the thing that we need to concentrate on.
Why do government agencies cover this stuff up? Is there not a system of checks and balances where someone throughout the process wouldn't have uncovered these facts and the truth come to light?
You're really perceptive, and you've asked wonderful questions, and I appreciate your being so ready to talk to me. Thank you. A lot of interviewers aren't. Anytime you are asking the government to investigate the government, it is a tall tale. It doesn't matter whether it's Dorothy's case or JFK's or Marilyn's or what we have now with regard to the investigation of, you can't even count how many police shootings of black individuals in our country never got any further than a merit board or a police review board or whatever. Very few of them were ever taken by prosecutors to juries. None of that has happened. Now, maybe there's time for a change with what happened to Mr. Floyd, the tragedy there. Maybe that will happen. But I'm guaranteeing you that any time, and I ran into this, I truly believe that the New York District Attorney's Office did not drop the investigation into Dorothy's death because it was too expensive, too time-consuming, or whatever. Basically, they were going to be looking into how the government agencies, the New York Police Department, and the DA's office in 1965 botched Dorothy Kilgallen's death. And that is a tall order. They do not want to take blame. It's just it's part of the animal. You just don't have that. Look at the Epstein case in New York City. That just was covered up as quickly as possible. No investigation of any kind. And why? Because if they start looking into that, you're going to find government agencies who obviously should have investigated his running around with all those teenage girls and doing it with celebrities and all these other kind of things. It just doesn't happen, and it's just it's incredible that it doesn't, but it's predictable in many ways, Russell. That's for sure.
One last question for you, Mark, and it's the biggest question of all. And I don't care who the trigger man was because it's a moot point. But from your research, can you tell us who the mastermind of the JFK assassination was?
Well, again, I think you have to look at me, and I go back to, I had a long conversation with Bill Alexander, who is the prosecuting attorney of Jack Ruby. And he's the one who clued me into what I believe happened, what I believe Dorothy believe happened, and what now so many millions of people, I think, across the world believe. That Bobby Kennedy had many more enemies than John Kennedy did. So if you take that as the truth, you look back at who had the greatest motive to have killed JFK. Now, of course, Lyndon Johnson comes into view because he became president. But there's no credible evidence that he orchestrated the assassination. So you go back to Marcello. He was going to lose everything. He was going to go to jail, prison. He was going to be deported. His billion-dollar empire would have been destroyed. He had everything to lose. And so common sense, which I believe Dorothy figured out and so many have, if you kill Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy comes after you with everything the government has. But if you kill Bobby Kennedy, if you kill JFK, Bobby Kennedy is powerless. And the proof there is that's what happened. He never went after them again. He finally resigned the presidency, and I will tell you right now, I think one day, and I'm not going to do it because I don't want to get into this part of it, but Bobby Kennedy then was killed in 1968. And I believe he was killed because he had the audacity to run for president. And now you've got all those mobsters out there believing that if he becomes president, now he's going to come after them for killing JFK. So we had 3 deaths from 1962 to 1965, and then 4 deaths in 6 years, all connected. But as I say, I'm not going to look into Bobby Kennedy's death, although his son has now said he doesn't believe that Sirhan Sirhan was the actual shooter of Robert Kennedy. You can look that up as to what he's saying about it. But yeah, to answer your question, Carlos Marcello is the one who had the means, the motive, means, opportunity, and benefit from the crime, so as to be the one who orchestrated the assassination.
And then, of course, we have the death of JFK Jr. in a plane crash, which is also suspect.
Well, there's another mystery for you, Russell.
And another book you can write.
Yes.
Mark, how can the audience learn more about your research?
Well, you can go to markshawbooks.com. I've had a checkered career. I've had, I think we at one point counted I had about 35 different careers. But, you know, at markshawbooks.com. Please, though, go to the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. And again, at my website, the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. Those are the most, the most interesting, I think, of the things that I've been able to bring forward. They're my contributions to history, Russell, just as you're doing every day by having people like me on the programs.
Your new book, Collateral Damage, is going to be released next year?
In the spring of next year, yes.
Would you like to return and do a show on it?
I'd be happy to if you're willing to. Sure, absolutely.
Mark, we'll talk again when you release Collateral Damage next year. I've had a great time chatting with you. Mark Shaw, thank you so much for being a guest on the Russell Scott Show.
Thank you, and stay safe. Bye-bye.